Welcome to this conversation on our prime time about same-sex marriage and the judgment given to us by the Supreme Court. I have with me today two of the main petitioners who took that fight to Supreme Court. Their names are Kavita, Arora, and Ankita Khanna. Both of them are mental health professionals. And they started this fight in October 2020 when they went first to the Delhi High Court as a same-sex couple seeking the legal right to get married. Now, their argument was basically that not allowing them to get married is a violation of their right to equality. And the argument was that after the reading down of 377, that basically said that if you are in a same-sex relationship or a non-heterosexual relationship, that it's no longer illegal. They said that now that our relationships are not illegal, we should be allowed to marry because there are so many rights that are fundamental to us that are being withheld because of this. Remember, if you are married, you're allowed to open joint bank accounts, you're allowed to buy homes together, you're allowed to inherit each other's property, you're allowed to be next of kin when it comes to hospital decisions, you're allowed to be next of kin when it comes to final rights. So many things in your workplace. You're allowed to rent homes. You're taken, you're looked at differently by society completely. There are so many things linked to being married that are being withheld from the members of the LGBTQI community because they're not allowed to marry. That was the argument that was placed before the High Court. Um, the case then went before the Supreme Court and then before a constitutional bench, the five-judge bench. This took 3 years, including the arguments. And of course, it was combined with other cases of an Indian who wanted to marry a foreigner who was same-sex, and various representatives of various religions also came forward and put forth their points of view. Surprisingly, all of them, not surprisingly, all of the various religions agreed that this was not okay. But finally, it came down to the government's argument, and the government's argument before the Supreme Court was this, this is a job for Parliament, because the argument then finally whittled down to only one thing. Now, you'll remember in India, there are various laws for various religions. So you have a Christian Marriage Act, a Muslim Marriage Act, a Hindu Marriage Act, a Special Marriage Act. So it's because the Indian law recognizes and respects the different customs within each religion when it comes to marriage, right? Now, finally, the Supreme Court said, let's only examine the Special Marriage Act, because within the Special Marriage Act, that's the act under which Indians from different religions can marry each other. And it's normally a civil wedding or a court marriage, what we call a court marriage in India. Now, within the Special Marriage Act, it says a man and a woman. And the appeal before the Supreme Court was, can that be changed to spouses, thereby allowing non-heterosexual relationships as well? The government's argument here in response was, it might seem like it's just a small change, but it's going to actually, impact far-reaching. It's going to have far-reaching impact on many laws, on inheritance, on divorce, on adoption, on custody, all of these things. And so it's not for the judiciary. It would be judiciaries, would be overreaching. In order to be able to do this, it's actually the job of Parliament. So allow Parliament to do it. This is what the government argued before the Supreme Court. And it turns out from the Supreme Court's decision that the Supreme Court agreed with the government. Now, we've had 36 hours to process this. And just to give you a quick understanding of what the Supreme Court in India said, the Supreme Court declined to legalize same-sex marriage, effectively placing that onus on Parliament and state governments to decide whether non-heterosexual relationships can be legally recognized. This was a five-judge bench, so it was a 3-2 verdict. 3 said no, 2 said yes. Now, these are the things that all 5 agreed on. 1, that same-sex couples do not have a right to marry, even though they can enter relationships. It's not a right, they can't demand it. Transgender people can marry under the already existing laws, and same-sex couples who have a right to choose their partner and cohabit, but not a right to marry. The 3 versus 2 argument was that same-sex couples do not have a right to adopt, and they do not have the right to enter a civil union. Now, this is where we are at this point. And of course, the question is, where do we go from here, and what happens in the future? So joining me right now are Ankita Khanna and Kavita Arora, who are the petitioners of this case, right from Delhi High Court till the five judgment of the Supreme Court. They've had a very rough couple of days processing, this judgment and what it means. So they needed a couple of days to process before we could talk about it. We're talking about it today, and they've been very kind, to continue to sort of support, all of the young people, all the people across the country who are also hopeful with them, for this judgment. They're here with me right now. Ankita and Kavita, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I wish we were speaking under different circumstances. Unfortunately, we're not. And I know that it's been a very long road and a long, hard battle for you. Uh, do you plan to keep fighting?
I don't think there's any question about that. I think we entered into this knowing that the fight has been ongoing. It's a movement. This is not the start of the fight, and therefore, similarly, it can't be the end of one. So this is one chapter of a very long, very hard, very fat tome of a book that will ultimately, hopefully, be a historical book. So this is one chapter, and I think the fight has been on for a very long time in so many different dimensions. And we take heart from that. I think it'll have to go on. It's such a fundamental. Yeah. Sorry. Please.
Sorry, no. Before we started this conversation, you said you've had 36 hours now to process the judgment. You're a lot more hopeful now than you were when you just heard that judgment. It's a very cliched question for a journalist to ask. कैसे महसूस हो रहा है आपको? But I want to know what the last 36 hours have been like. How many people have reached out to you? What the messages have been like? And I know that this is also a time when the community has really come together. Walk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a roller coaster, needless to say. I think the whole week was filled with anticipation, and we were wondering, okay, which day is it going to be? As petitioners, we were talking with each other, our legal team. So many people who were following the movement were reaching out on Twitter. People young and old. A 60-year-old couple that had been waiting for this to happen. So one of them, their health is deteriorating. So they were counting on this verdict to be able to take medical decisions for each other. Young college students were reaching out to us. So there was a lot of anticipation, not just ours. I think I remember so clearly the morning of Tuesday when we were driving to the Supreme Court. So much hope, so much optimism, I think, in our hearts. And I think the thing we were really looking forward to, Faye, was just being able to see each other, all the petitioners. And I think when we met and saw that light in each other's eyes, I think that faith was just restored, and we just kind of entered the courtroom as one. As you can imagine, sometimes these court proceedings are very technical. There's a lot of legalese. So, even while standing there, sometimes it's a very surreal feeling that, okay, this is being said. These are the implications it will have or not have on our lives. And you're not allowed to talk in the courtroom. So you just look at each other, make eye contact. Am I hearing this right? Is this really happening? And there were obviously these 4 judgments were read out. We quickly realized, okay, it's probably
not very quickly.
Not
and this was sorry to interrupt you. So for those people who are not legal reporters, right? I used to rely on my colleague who was a legal reporter very heavily because it's a little tricky. The first 2 judgments are very pro. And, in the beginning, you feel like, oh my God, this is amazing. When the Chief Justice was reading out his judgment, you're like, wow, is this my country we're talking about? This is awesome. And then as it went further, at a point where like, hang on, how many is that? How many 2? How many 4? Where are we? What is the score at this point, right? Because you need 3 out of 5. We don't know who has said what. You have to pay really close attention to understand what each of them, and only the lawyers are getting it at this point. Yeah. So I felt that that was emotionally a roller coaster for
It
everyone, and
was.
also it's yeah.
Yeah. And one of my friends asked me later, she said, were you able to make better sense of this in the courtroom? And quite frankly, I don't think so, because, the lawyers are right ahead, we are right in the back, we are
Mm.
only looking at each other. And you're right, we were also doing this math, ki, okay, 3, 2, 2, 1, what's happening? And we realized it was obviously the majority was not in favor of even a civil union. And before we knew it, the bell rang for lunch, and the bench got up and joined their hands, bowed to us, and left. And I cannot tell you, it was really like, it was so abrupt. And I mean, I just broke down in that moment because of the abruptness of it. That, okay, that's it. Like 3 years for this moment. And we just all looked at each other, held each other, and I think I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you remember?
I think
Yeah.
we've had some time to process it as
Yeah.
well. I mean, it was gut wrenching at that time, and um, and a deep disappointment. I mean, I don't think that there's any other way to put it. Um, but I think we're all human. We try and process our emotions. We try and figure out what we're going to do next, what this means, put it in context, all of those things. I think over a period of time, we will recover from this. There will be, I mean, in the movement, what we have seen is at each point in each chapter, there are a few people who will take the forefront, others will back them. That's how movements run. And that's how they're supposed to run, because they're also emotionally immersive for the people who are in it. So, yeah, I think I'm just being rational now
No,
after two
yeah,
days.
no,
But,
you are right. I
but yeah,
mean, yeah,
but yeah,
that has kicked in now, and
yeah.
yeah,
But also it's symbolic, like when you were saying roller coaster, even the entire 2 hours or 1.5 hours of the judgment itself or the verdict itself being read out was symbolic. This is how it has been,
Yeah.
building up of hope and expectation and saying, hey, this is the progress my country is making, look, they heard us, this is what it is. And then
Yeah.
like, what
Because
just happened?
you're so right. Because the judgments, when it was being read out, it was obvious that they heard you, they saw you, they understood the argument you were making. They understood what you were asking for. They also understood there was not a lot to ask for, and you were perhaps already entitled to it, but not today.
Yeah, yeah, not today and not by this
Mm.
instrument or
yeah.
of the country. So
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, I think we'll absorb it. We'll carry on in many ways. We'll remember it. I don't think we don't remember things that happen,
Mm.
and it will be emotional. And I think the impact is still being received and absorbed.
Mm.
We're still having people reach out to us, especially the youngsters. I went back into clinic today. We'd taken a day off afterwards. And I think right from the beginning, since the morning, the few people that I met, each one of them spoke to me about the judgment. Um, the tables were turned because they were asking me, how are
Yeah.
you feeling today? And by the end of the day, I was laughing and saying, guys, this is my question to ask. This is how I start my session with you. And yeah, so it was heartening in many ways.
Yeah.
Also, the absorption of disappointment from them, and sometimes the dismissal of, don't worry,
Mhm.
not a great country to be with, which I'm trying to tell them, no, we stay here, and
Yeah,
it is a great country to be
yeah.
with. Let's try and do something
Yeah,
well here.
it's also our country, so we have to fight.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
you know, it's easy for everybody. It's easy to give up and leave, but if everyone gives up and leaves, who's going to stay and fight? Someone's got to stay and fight. Um, and I was going to ask you this question a little later. Both of you are mental health professionals. You deal with emotions in counseling and things like that. And I know that from the beginning, and when we talked, and for our audience, that interview is available on YouTube, the one that we did it in 2020 when this had just started. The petition had just gone to Delhi High Court. You talked about how it's important for young people right now coming to terms with their sexual orientation, coming to terms with their gender, to be able to do that in a more open society where the law is on their side. Um, as mental health professionals, how tough do you think it's going to be for members of the community to have heard the highest, court of our land say, hey, you are free to enter a relationship, but we are under no obligation to recognize that relationship and give it rights.
Like we said in the 2020 conversation, Faye, I think every single day of our day jobs, we sit across young people who are filled with questions, confusion about their gender and sexuality. And we also hear the other stories, of how um, judgments like the 2018 judgment, what an impact it had made on their lives, and allowing them to have conversations with their families, allowing them to come out to themselves, allowing them to seek safer communities in which they could be themselves wholly. So we've also been witness to that. So we know that one of the things that even the idea of this being fought in court in the last 3 years was doing for young people was giving them a tremendous sense of hope and optimism that this can happen in my country. By the time I'm of legal age, maybe not only will it not be a crime, I can just introduce somebody to my parents, to the aunties and uncles in my neighborhood, rent a place with them, buy a place with them, open a bank account with them, just like anybody else, because
Yeah.
that is how some people think of their future. Na? They think of all
Yeah.
these adult milestones. So, needless to say, I think it's going to be, and it is a huge setback.
Mm.
Yeah.
And there's a certain sense of, sometimes what we are finding is there's a certain sense of skepticism and cynicism that comes in, then that this is what is expected of the adults who don't understand, etc., etc. However, may I also say that what I'm, and it's too soon again post the verdict, but from whatever little in the last 2 days we've had as interactions one on one or in small groups that we have, one of the things that did happen or has started happening is there were people and there are people who were not aware that the right to a relationship in itself was something that the Naped Johar um, uh, reading down
Judgment.
judgment had actually said was fine,
Yeah.
was allowed. And I've had people coming in and saying, hey, but isn't this good? This is what they said you can do. And we were like, this is just reinstating or
What was
reinforcing this
already there? Yeah.
law. We're really looking for a silver lining. Here is, whoever didn't know this, there is an X percentage which is starting to get to know that this was already there, or they're thinking this is new. But it does increase the number of people who are coming to know something. So
Yeah.
it's almost
No,
like
so,
saying,
so
highlight.
yeah. So that that I completely am on board with that, because what happens when there's such a loud sort of coverage of judgment. Um, it's written about extensively. There's a lot of buzz about it on social media. It's on the mainstream news. So a lot of our parents are listening to these arguments. So they're being made aware of the fact that this is something uh, the Supreme Court is taking seriously. The fact that it's that serious. So it's no longer why don't you guys just quietly just live like
Yeah,
roommates and
for sure.
it's not that anymore. And I think that is a massive stride that we've
Mhm.
made. And you brought up the Nalsa judgment. There was the Puttaswamy judgment, Navdeep Singh Johar. So we've taken steps sort of incrementally, one by one by one. This would have been a massive new leap going forward, which we didn't get. But do you think that perhaps, and I know that it's unfair to ask you the legal way forward, but do you think perhaps smaller bites around the corner of this pie is perhaps what is needed now? Just take smaller, like, rights based on what the Supreme Court has said in this judgment?
So, I mean, I see it as somewhat more holistic than just legal bit, but just like you said,
Yes,
Faye,
please,
there are
please.
so many different dimensions. It's not just about the verdict; it's actually about the entire process of the petition. What happened with the petition? What happened to the community or from within the community? The joining of the petitions. What happened in terms of it starting off with two couples talking about marriage, one under the FMA, one under the SMA, to
Mm.
it expanding to the entire LGBTQI plus and across so many urban, non-urban, rural
Yeah, yeah,
representation. And that entire process, regardless of the verdict, I think has value in itself in so many different dimensions. It has already, I think, led to what you've called starting to do bits and pieces of the pie rather than a full chunk of it. I do know that over a period of time, there are more people who've actually approached the law courts in different parts of the country to exert or put petitions in for different kinds of things, that this sense of possibility that we can be
yeah,
protected as a community has already started happening. I think um, whether it is legal or it is social or it is part of other dimensions of our everyday lives, we have to keep moving forward in this way in all these dimensions.
yeah,
And the verdict, yeah, would have been a great victory. I think it would have underlined a whole lot of different things, but I don't think that the value of the entire process in my mind has decreased, only because of the verdict itself. So um,
mm.
yeah, I mean, we have to keep doing things. Some of it may be legal, some of it may be in different courts all across the country, different age groups, and that's Phoebe, whom you're following. Yeah.
So I actually have Phoebe and a 1-year-old under the table at this point. And for the audience as well, this is a conversation we were having before we started, where I was telling Kavita, and Ankita, that I felt before, when I was preparing to cover the judgment, that if the judgment was in favor of marriage equality, my son would be raised in a different India, in a more equal India, a fairer, perhaps, easier society to grow up in. Um, it was not meant to be today, but there's no reason why it still can't happen, in the future. I do want to ask you all this, you know, I do want to ask you all this. The court has put the ball in the court of the legislature, which is the parliament or state assemblies, saying this is the job for parliament. And it was almost, I mean, if we were to sort of really simplify the judgment, which let me say we shouldn't do, as a journalist, I shouldn't do, but I'm going to. Effectively, the court was saying, hey, you know what? I see what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I see the purpose of what you're saying. I get it. This is discriminatory. We agree. It should not be discriminatory, but it's not for us to make that change. It's for Parliament to make that change. So we're going to ask Parliament, to sort of refer it back to Parliament because it's their job. It's not our job. How hopeful are you of Parliament to, sort of take it up at all?
We have to be hopeful. I'd say it's as simple as that, because this is something that we have to impress upon people for the sake of, like you said, your son, for the sake
Yeah.
of the entire younger population that we see, which is actually looking to us now to say, what happens when you don't get something that you have fought for?
Yeah.
So one of the parents who came to me today said, you know what, I've taken your example today and spoken to my daughter, who's in her teens, to say, look, we know she's back at work today. What does
Yeah.
that mean? You can't give up. You have to be persistent. So I think that also stands for something. We can't give up. We just have to re-strategize. We just have to say, okay, if that's where we are being sent, this is also ours. This process is also ours. Ultimately, the legislature also represents us. So yes, we
And I
may need
think,
to re-strategize.
I think this is really important because for all of our cisgender heterosexual audience members, this is your life, right? You wake up, you wake up the next day after the judgment. You can't choose to be heterosexual, and this is who you are. And so, just by continuing to live and going to work and doing what you do on a daily basis, that is the fight. That is you, sort of digging your heels in and saying, hey, you know what, we're still here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we will be. This is our home too. So I think that's what I have to say. That I mean, I may not know today what we're going to do tomorrow in terms of carrying it forward and how to approach the legislature, etc., but we'll find a way. This is our home too. When you have to look after your home and you have to be mindful of what we are leaving for the next generation. If we are able to carry that, whether we are, LGBTQIA, whether we are cis, we are het, we are neurotypical, there's so many intersections. If we are mindful of what we are leaving to the ones who are being born, then we just have to find another way. You have to solve the problem that exists. One way didn't work, let's find another one.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of the ones who are being born, I think there was a massive blow there in terms of adoption. Uh, you know, the court saying that unmarried couples are not entitled to adopt, and that's not something that we're going to change, which is really, as the Chief Justice pointed out, really doesn't make sense because single people are allowed to adopt, but you know, same-sex couples or non-het couples are not allowed to adopt jointly. And given the fact that we're a country full of children who need safe and healthy homes, it is completely ridiculous that we're finding ways to keep them away from those safe and healthy homes. But I want you to just respond to the adoption question, and what that means for so many members in the community.
So I think it also, so again, I have two ways of looking at it. I usually do. One is to look at it from the point of view of those children out there. We also work with many organizations where there are children who are from orphanages, children who are homeless, children, they have one parent, one adult for 40 children. And that's the ratio that they are existing in. And these are the invisible problems that we talk of. Adoption is one problem. If you look at it from the point of view of the thousands and millions of children on the Indian streets and roads right now who don't have parents, if I for a minute ask everybody to say what would be their viewpoint if they got parents who were LGBTQI rather than not have a parent. So I would just say, look at that as a question. Look at that as a question for them and from their point of view. And then from the point of view of people who would put up their application for adoption. There will be LGBTQI couples who will not put them because they're not interested in children.
Yeah.
They're happy with it. Only the ones who really wish
who really want to
raise children. So actually you're looking at a segment of population that really wishes to nurture and build. And so I think that from that point of view, it makes complete sense. From the legal point of view, it doesn't make sense. From the scientific point of view, it doesn't make sense why it is like this. I think what has become clearer from these judgments.
Yes, forgive me.
I think what has become clearer from these judgments is also how many of the family laws, the way that they've been constituted, many of the adoption laws, many of the succession laws, so many of them have been written with the point of view of a binary. And therefore, they have become exclusionary. It's not even because it was never thought of. And I think adoption is one of those things. We are not being progressive when we are saying that we are looking at it as a problem. We're still looking at a framework of saying this is what a good parent is. But yeah, I think
I'm going to ask you to, if you have a message for young people, and I know that I'm sure you've thought a lot about this because you work so much with young people as mental health professionals, not just young people within the community, but all young people for whom it would have meant something to live in a country where this is possible. Not just people who are LGBTQI, but people who are het and cis who would have just wanted to be part of a more progressive society, a more accepting society. What is your message for them today?
I think if I had to really pare it down, it would be the change. Because I don't think in our wildest imaginations, two ordinary citizens like us could have imagined approaching the highest courts of the country with a problem that seemed so everyday to us. Very big, but very everyday to us. And I think really it's really about that we sometimes, it's very easy, like Kavita said, to be cynical, that our little one little actionable step that we take doesn't matter. But I think if there's anything we've learned from the last 3 years, Faye, I mean, I cannot tell you every single hearing, every little update about the case meant so much to so many people who were following it, that I think I just
Mm,
want to say that to young people, that never, uh, you know, uh, never underestimate the importance of doing that one thing.
yeah,
No matter how simple and small it is in your context, it makes a huge difference. And I think not everybody has to fight battles in the courtroom, but
yeah.
every one of them, every one of those steps matters. I think that would be my message.
No, I can't say it better. So yeah, if there is time, I can tell a story, but that's not.
Yeah.
Of course there is. Of course there is. Go ahead.
So this is a story that
Yeah.
I was thinking of while Ankita was speaking, and this is a question that often people ask me as well. Can I make a difference? How can I make a difference? It's such a big question. There's so many big institutions. How do I make a difference? And I used to try and find the words to answer that till I came across this story, and now I just tell this story. So it's called the starfish story. I don't know if you've heard it
Yeah.
or will have heard it, but I often tell it to children. Um, and the story goes that there's a monk who's walking on the beach, and as he turns a corner, he sees that there is this entire full beach full of millions and millions of what look like starfish strewn a bit away from the water. And as he's walking along, he's trying to figure out what's going on, and he comes across this little girl, 6 or 7 year old, who's bending down, picking up a starfish, throwing it back into the sea, then bending down again, picking it up, throwing it into the sea, and he's standing there and he's watching her. And then he goes up to her, and a few other people are standing and watching. And he says, "Little girl, what are you trying to do? Can't you see that there's so many of these fish? How are you going to, what are you trying to do?" And she said, "The tides come in, all these fish, starfish, I know they can't swim. They'll die if they're up on the beach all this time, if they don't get back into the water." And he said, "But there's so many. How can you make a difference?" And so she starts looking crestfallen, and she for the first time almost looks up, looks at the beach, and realizes how big a problem it is. So she starts walking away. And then something in her changes, and she turns back. And these 3, 4 people are talking about her foolishness. When she turns back and they see her walking back, pick up another one, look very resolutely at it, and throw it back into the sea. And the monk goes up to her and says, "What happened?" And she looked at the starfish, threw it back, and said, "I made a difference to that one." And there's a sequel to that. The story actually ends there, but I often tell a sequel, which is that as this starts happening and the people around her are laughing, a little boy comes, stand next to her, and joins in throwing them. And then comes another little boy and another one, and in no time there is a line of villagers and their children standing and putting all those starfish back into the sea. And 20 years later, another sequel, a sequel to the sequel. There's this man who's visiting the village with his little girl, who's about 6 or 7. And they turn the corner where the monk had come. And this little girl says, "Hey, daddy, what's going on here?" Because there's this huge line of people standing at the beach, and they seem to be throwing starfish into the sea. So this man narrates this story to her and says, "I was that little boy. Now every year they know this is going to happen. And all the villagers from all over come and they make sure that all the starfish go back into the sea." And that's the
Right.
story.
Go ahead. That's tough issues. So I think for me personally, tracking this case very, very closely, uh, for me the answer would be an allyship,
Hmm.
and to just, to tell. one member of the community, if you can, that person is seen and heard. And hey, I can see what you're going through, and I understand what you're going through, and I empathize what you're going through, and I understand that it's unfair. Just acknowledging that this is unfair, I think, is massive, because it's stuff that we otherwise don't even bother to think about. We take so much for granted as heterosexual people. We don't empathize enough about what that must be like to live your life without that societal sort of acceptance of your relationship, and how much is strung to that. I genuinely believe that in this country, you're only taken seriously as an adult after you get married. And until then, you're sort of in training to be an adult. That's sort of like the turning point at which everybody suddenly starts treating you like a grown up, because it doesn't matter, what you've achieved, how many cars you bought, how many houses you bought, until you get married, they don't sort of treat you like a grown up. And the fact that there is sorry?
You're settled after that.
You're settled after that, right? So the fact that there's an entire community of people in our country who are not allowed to do that, while we place so much importance to it, is, fundamentally unfair. And I do hope that some point in the future we can have this conversation again, the three of us, about that finally no longer being the case. But thank you so much, Ankita and Kavita, for the fight, and for your determination, and for sharing that strength with everyone in the country over the last 3 years. I wish you very, very good luck.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for
Thank
seeing
you,
us. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that brings us to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, if you have questions, you can drop it on our comment section. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page. We're going to try and bring you more and more conversations like this in the future. Thank you for watching.
For more news and updates, download the Beetroot News app from the App Store and the Play Store.